The White House announced new sanctions on Russia Wednesday for its use of a nerve agent against a former Russian spy. The State Department says the Russian government violated an international ban on chemical weapons in its assassination attempt on Sergei Skripal and his daughter. The sanctions aim to deny Russia access to U.S. goods and technologies that are sensitive in regards to national security. Major Garrett has more.
The sanctions penalize Russia for a nerve agent attack against a former Russian military officer turned British spy and his daughter. Both were sickened but survived. The attack happened in March in Salisbury, England. Russia has denied responsibility. The new sanctions, which take effect August 22nd, block Russia from purchasing potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons, electronics, and aviation-related equipment from the U.S. In March, the U.S. expelled 60 Russian diplomats for the poisoning.
There's never been a president as tough on Russia as I have been.
But even as his administration has taken action, the president himself continues to make overtures to the Kremlin. Today, he sent a letter to President Vladimir Putin introducing Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul, who was visiting Moscow.
We want to have open lines of communication.
Last week, at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania, Mr. Trump touted his relationship with the Russian president.
But I got along great with Putin.
But earlier that day, top administration officials said Russian attacks on U.S. elections are continuing.
We continue to see a pervasive messaging campaign by Russia to try to weaken and divide the United States.
And CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett is in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. Major, what more do we know about Rand Paul's goals on this trip to Russia? And on a day we're talking about sanctions, what does this say about the state of U.S.-Russia relations?
That it goes back and forth, and this administration is not the least bit uncomfortable with sending mixed signals privately and publicly about its intentions toward Russia. And what we do know is Senator Paul and President Trump discussed the agenda of this meeting at the White House recently, and as a part of that conversation, it was conveyed by Senator Paul to President Trump, "I'd like a letter of introduction to Vladimir Putin," and the president authorized the creation of that letter. It went through all the various channels within the U.S. government, was approved by all the relevant stakeholders. I'm sure the State Department, National Security Council, and others were involved. And with a bit of formality, Senator Paul presented that to Vladimir Putin as a way of suggesting issues that might be topical if these lines of communication, either through Senator Paul or others, are in fact open and productive. What's interesting about the letter, it's not counterterrorism cooperation. That's something that has endured between the United States and Russia, even in the worst of times. What's interesting is the letter says maybe we can cooperate on Ukraine and Syria. Well, that's not happening now, and it hasn't happened for a good long while, especially Syria, where recent agreements made by President Trump with Vladimir Putin are at this very day, and have been for weeks, before the Helsinki summit and afterwards, being violated or at least flouted at the edges by Russia in Syria. So to point out in this letter, hey, how about Ukraine and Syria, is odd, considering the U.S. and Russia are very much at odds about conflicts in both places.
And your story also mentioned the new sanctions. What do we know about the economic impact of these, and why now, since this is a case that was first mentioned back in March?
Well, it was mentioned in March, and there's been increasing pressure on the Trump White House to do something in terms of new sanctions as a result of this nerve agent attack against a former Russian military officer turned spy for the British government, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter, Yulia. That happened in March, as you accurately pointed out, Brooke. And Republicans, as well as Democrats, but this administration tends to pay more attention to Republicans, have been leaning on the White House to use a 1991 law to put sanctions on Russia for its use of a chemical or biological weapon. The administration had sort of been slow walking that. And Ed Royce, who is the California House Republican who chairs the Foreign Affairs Committee, had given the White House, according to a letter he recently sent to the White House, a deadline of today to do something about sanctions, or he was going to make an even bigger stink about it. Well, the deadline came today, and the White House acted with these sanctions. As to their effect, it all depends on how much avionics and electronic equipment Russia intends to buy from U.S. suppliers. It could be in the millions if they are so inclined. If they want to avoid sanctions, maybe they have to purchase those somewhere or forestall those purchases until this is resolved. But the sanctions are real, and if there is no change in behavior on the Russians and no access that they give to international inspectors about chemical or biological weapons, and you can be pretty sure that's not going to happen, there could be a second round of sanctions. So the sanctions part of the story has phase one. It may have a phase two.
There was also this discussion today about whether the president will speak to Robert Mueller. What do we know about the terms of what each side wants or is asking if they're going to have this meeting?
Right. I have calls out to Rudy Giuliani, currently the president's lead attorney. He hasn't returned them, but he was in a very interesting bit of sort of media managing. Rudy Giuliani was on a radio show hosted by Jay Sekulow. For those in our audience who may remember that name, Jay Sekulow is the president's other attorney. So
truly everyone has a podcast these days.
Was talking to another presidential attorney about their strategy with Robert Mueller. Talk about a completely self-contained bit of political and public relations management. Anyway, what has been true for weeks is still true. Negotiations continue. Optimism is low. Appetite very high in the White House for Robert Mueller to present a report on whatever he's learned about what he believes did or did not happen by way of collusion or cooperation or conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russians during 2016. And they want that done sooner rather than later. No commitment from Special Counsel Mueller on that front. And the confines of these conversations are to limit the president's exposure to possibly difficult questions that may come from the special counsel. And there's really no evidence that the special counsel is prepared to give up anywhere near as much ground as the president's attorneys wanted to create the atmosphere in which both sides would be comfortable for an interview. So the probability of that is still extremely low.
And so we wait as November looms. Major Garrett, thanks.
You got it.